Thank you for the warm welcome, Charlie. Also, I am loving the chat, honestly. Like, I wish I could just take the next 5 minutes to like read all the answers. Aaliyah, specifically, I'm very glad that you said tiramisu because that came to mind. If I were to give my answer, okay, wait. So Dkéama Alexis, I use he, she, they pronouns, but if you forget to switch it up, you can use they, them. I know I'm not this basic, but I love just like a regular like New York cheesecake, like a regular glazed donut, just like no frills, no spills. But I am also prone to like really spending a lot of money on pistachio baklava at Lavash. If you are in Columbus, you can go get it. So I think in order to start the presentation, I have like a PowerPoint. Charlie, I emailed it to you. Would you be able to share your screen? Because I have notes that I'm going to look off of on my end. Thank you. Yes, no, Ezra, copy what you said. I'm also getting a lot of suggestions on what I need to try. Dope. So, oh, that's not supposed to say each one teach one. So, each one teach one is BQIC's internal sort of political education series of things that we offer our members, sort of with a like pro-Black, pro-queer, pro-trans, pro-liberation lens. This lunch and learn today is very specifically not just on the history of policing and abolition, but wanting to have a very specific intersectional lens around the origins of the US police state and its legacy of oppressing Black, queer, and trans people specifically. This is a discussion that I gave at a teach-in that we had outside of the State House with activist arts called Imagining a World Without Police or Prisons. So if you missed that teach-in, then you're gonna get same information today. We can head to the next slide. Okay, so just a brief background. I'm here, like, I don't know, representing BQIC and not, like, I'm an individual, but the personal is political, vice versa. So to talk a little bit about like this thing I helped create. BQIC is a grassroots community organization that works towards the liberation of Black, queer, trans, and intersex people from all walks of life through direct action, community organizing, education on our issues, which is why we're here today, and creating spaces to uplift our voices. Ariana Steele and I created this organization largely out of the need to have a space where, as Black LGBTQ plus people, we could exist without compromise. When trying to get started in activism here in Columbus, we'd go into spaces led by white people, including white queer people, and came across a lot of racism, unsurprisingly. And then in spaces organizing around Black liberation and racial justice, we would come across a lot of homophobia and transphobia. So after meeting with lots of other Black, queer, and trans people in Central Ohio and in the city, we came up with BQIC and kind of hit the ground running a week after our first project, which was a zine release. We hit the ground running by providing grassroots defense support to the Black Pride 4 after their arrest at the Columbus Pride Parade. Next slide. This slide is very important to me, so please keep this message. So this is a boundary that I have. Before any speaking engagement, I just like to set that with people who are non-Black, but especially if they are white. I get really pissed off if people say thank you to me at the end of a presentation and that's all they have. The work that I do is not for non-Black people. Very specifically, like I just said, BQIC was created with the intention of providing support to Black LGBTQIA+ people, which serves the overall work towards liberation, Black liberation in general. So if you're non-Black and especially if you're white, don't thank me with your words alone. That goes especially if you're white, and I'm being dead ass when I say that. You can thank me by sending money to @FuckAllCops on Venmo with the subject line Lunch and Learn. Alternatively, you can support BQIC's work if you don't feel like giving to an individual. You can support our work, and there'll be more information on that at the end of the presentation. The best thanks you can give me is by ensuring that I can continue to do my work. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a police state? Sorry, I've like already lost my notes. Okay, perfect. So a police state is basically any state or country that relies primarily on police or prisons to keep people in order. Another definition of a police state might be a state dependent on fear to keep people in order. So that can be what we live in here in the United States is an example of a police state. You know, at this point in time, policing is like a pretty common facet of our everyday life. I'm going to try to replicate something that I did at the teach-in, which is, you know, you can use your thumbs up reaction or just like send something in the chat, like an exclamation point, if you have seen the TV show Cops. You can just like send something in the chat, do a thumbs up, make a motion. Okay. Do another different thing if you have seen a cop in a hospital. Lots of exclamation points and emojis and yeses. Send something in the chat, make a motion if somebody suggested someone else get arrested or go to jail for some wrongdoing they might have done. Okay, lots of yeses, numbers, characters, so on and so forth. So yes, I think just like these few examples that I've given so far have kind of shown the different ways that policing has shown up in different facets of our life. You know, we see them in our media, we see them in our schools, we see them just like as like an everyday part of our life. But policing wasn't always an institution. Before I get to that, though, I want to move forward to the next slide, which is talking specifically around the intersections that I'm trying to raise up here. Yeah, I did. I think I said, no, I said hospitals. But yes, schools is a different public service. I just got a little bit, my wires crossed. So the examples that I gave kind of shows the different ways in which like policing touches different parts of our lives. But in discussions around policing and police violence, Black, queer, and trans people and our specific intersecting identities are often left out of discussions on the violence of policing. And it's really important for us to analyze the fact that policing supports and is supported by white supremacy and capitalism, yes, but also homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny. Black, queer, and trans people bear the brunt of those oppressions all at once because we are the most disenfranchised and marginalized by these systems of oppression. So just to talk a little bit more about the background of how we can just be left out of conversations, I'd like to move to the next slide. So, you know, by now, a lot of us have heard the hashtag Black Lives Matter. That hashtag really came about after the vigilante murder of Trayvon Martin, who was a young Black boy. And when the creators of this hashtag sent it out into the world, it picked up like wildfire, and you know, the rest is history. But I think it's important to note two things here. One, it took the death of a young Black boy in order to spark this national movement. And two, what we don't hear often is that the creators of this hashtag are three Black queer women whose labor and whose invention often gets left out of the conversation and doesn't get paid enough respect. You can look into them. Their names are Opal Tometi, Patrice Cullors, and Alicia Garza. Another example in which our specific struggles are co-opted away from us is with the Say Her Name hashtag. In talking about how police violence victims, specifically those who are women, especially those who are trans women, do not get the same amount of time in the sun, Say Her Name was created to address that fact and uplift the lives of Black women and girls who we lose to police violence. So anytime we hear people say his name in the streets, or if you see that online, just know that it's a violent and blatantly disrespectful co-optation of the movement being created around Say Her Name and the reason for why it exists. But not to get too far ahead of myself, I think what I'd like to do is, introduce a historical perspective of policing, how we kind of got to this point of it ruling different parts of our lives. So though I, as a trans person, don't believe in binaries, I'll kind of structure the next part of this conversation to be binary-like. So if you can go to the next slide. Before I get to the northern and southern states, I do want to say, so policing wasn't always an institution. It was actually modeled after volunteer-based watch groups that existed in Great Britain. A lot of our early society was modeled after Great Britain, so we kind of copied what they had going on there. Their volunteer-based watch groups were often used to respond to kind of public nuisances or helping people with smaller public services. But they were also expected to help patrol the neighborhoods, they were expected to patrol the neighborhoods. These volunteer-based watch groups, because they weren't incentivized really, they would kind of slack off. They would often be drunk or otherwise not engaging with the task that they were supposed to be doing. So later on, constables were hired to complement and add to the volunteer watch groups. And then they took on the non-law enforcement duties. So as we kind of modeled our system after theirs, we began rapidly urbanizing in the 1700s and 1800s. So as populations began centralized and concentrated in cities, various conflicts began to erupt, and centralized police departments came together in more formalized ways. So to get to the binary that I was talking about, we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So those different conflicts were existing throughout the United States as it existed in that time, but it kind of took on different forms in the northern states versus in the southern states, though of course there was some overlap because there are no true binaries in life, y'all. So in the northern states, like I was talking about with the rapidly urbanizing cities, police departments emerged primarily to manage crowds and protect businesses. The first police department in Boston was established around 1800, and that, of course, served as the model for police departments afterwards. A lot of these business owners who were in the rapidly urbanizing cities in the north were interested in protecting their wealth and protecting their property. but they didn't want to put out the money that it would have cost them to either repair things that were broken or stolen from them, to properly insure the places. So what they did was shift the cost onto the state, and they hired police officers to work for them to patrol the neighborhoods around their businesses, to clear out the dangerous underclass of people they thought to be undesirable, unsafe. The wealthy business owners, were the ones who got to define what order and disorder looked like. And so that's how it started becoming centralized in northern states. And then in southern states, police evolved pretty much directly from the slave patrols that existed to monitor and punish Black populations. They started to really come together in the 1600s and the 1700s, but especially in South Carolina, but they'd existed across the southern states. As you might imagine, slave patrols had three main functions, which were to capture and escaped enslaved people, deter the possibility of slave revolt, and dole out vigilante justice to any enslaved people who defied plantation law. So these slave patrols existed as tools of punishment, enslavement, and resistance repression. But it's one thing I would like to point attention to is in 1819 in South Carolina, again, South Carolina has a lot going on. There was a law passed that made it law for all white men over the age of 18 to become part of a slave patrol. And if they were to break that law, it would be punishable by fine. So by legal process, it was inscribed into the general white populace in the South to terrorize Black populations and to see Black people as inherently less than human, inferior, and fugitive. So you can go to the next slide. That's what that's about. Just get a little visual. So these initial origins show us that policing is inherently embedded in white supremacy and capitalistic greed. And it's all about protecting business interests and protecting property, as well as it is about destroying Black life. And that is very clear from the way that the anti-Black terror was cemented into civil society. You can move on. All right, so as I was saying, who is a criminal? That question of who gets defined as a criminal was largely left up to those who held a lot of financial and racial power at the time, so white and wealthy people. They were the ones who got to label poor people, Black people, immigrants, and refugees to be part of the dangerous underclass, and social disorder was ascribed to these groups of people. And of course, not only race and class and national origin played into this, but gender and sexuality had a major role in who was considered to be criminal, quote unquote, or deviant. And queer and trans people have always challenged the status quo. So let's use the chat again. We had a lot of responses earlier, so I know y'all are tapped in. If you have heard of the name Mary Jones before, send something in the chat, make a motion. Okay, much less activity, which goes to show you, again, the importance of centering Black trans narratives as we look at police violence and as we also try to come up with solutions for it. So Mary Jones was a Black trans sex worker in the 1800s, lived in New York, who was imprisoned for grand larceny after stealing money from a client of hers. So not only was she imprisoned for grand larceny, of course not in a woman's prison, But she was also demonized for quote unquote cross-dressing and for her deviant behavior. She was literally nicknamed the man monster. You can move to the next slide so folks can see a picture of her. So she was named the man monster, literally in the media and the press, in common conversation, was labeled as less than human for doing what she needed to do in order to survive, because as a Black trans people, opportunities are not afforded to you in order to have access to the resources you need. So, you know, there's been a long thread of people who are gender nonconforming or trans that has existed for centuries, of gender nonconforming communities, trans communities being targeted by white supremacists, especially as they've been getting paid to terrorize us. But to move to the next slide. 1848 is when a law was passed here in so-called Columbus, Ohio, that forbade a person from appearing in public in a dress, quote unquote, in a dress not belonging to his or her sex. Their essentialist language is theirs, not mine. So like here, and like this was the nexus in a lot of ways for trans misogynist and transphobic law being inscribed into our nation, that served as the inspiration for continuing to target people like Mary Jones, for continuing to create conditions that allow gender nonconforming people to feel unsafe walking down the street. So to move forward, we can move to the next slide. Is there anything on that? No. So this next section is going to be the spread of anti-Black and anti-trans police violence during the Reconstruction era. So the Reconstruction era is the period of time after the Civil War ended. No, folks might have heard of the Emancipation Proclamation before, how it was signed in 1863, but they'd waited 2 years to read it to enslaved people in Texas, and it was that event in 1865 that signaled the quote unquote abolition of slavery and the end of the Civil War. I say abolition in quotes because we got like a whole ass 36 more slides in the presentation. Y'all, like, slavery's not abolished, it's still here. What they did was a negative process of refusing to say that they were enslaving Black and African populations officially. But by reading this, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, that didn't give people that didn't give Black folks their rights. That certainly didn't. It just instead, slavery just seamlessly transitioned into new institutions. Policing just became more centralized as a response to the de jure abolition of slavery. So if you move on to the next slide. We saw slave codes, which were codes, laws during the era of chattel slavery, meant to punish and track and monitor the lives of enslaved people, just seamlessly transitioned into Black codes. So it was just another way, it was just a direct evolution of seeing Blackness as inherently criminal. It was just another way of reinscribing that so that Black populations could be under control and under, specifically, like, behind bars and in cages. It's also important to have an intersectional lens when looking at the Reconstruction era, because the abolition, the negative abolition of slavery, where they just like took it away in name, but not in reality, this had like very real consequences, of course, for Black folks, not just in terms of the law, but also in terms of social clashes. People who were just on slave patrols started working for what were then formalized as police departments. So Black folks were still living in constant like fear and under constant terror. Black veterans who had just served in the Civil War weren't seen as any more human than Black folks who had just been freed from bondage. So if you were to move to the next slide, there were a series of riots across the United States in 1866, but I'll focus specifically on two. So the Memphis Massacre happened across, it was the beginning of May in 1866. There were rising post-Civil War tensions between the resentful white populace, and newly free and mobile Black people. And there were incidences of police violence that were happening in Memphis, where specifically police officers would go into Black gatherings, Black parties, any sort of grouping of Black folks to brutalize them, arrest them, throw them in jail under charges of insolence, however you might want to like define that. And they had also at different points like charged or tried to accuse a group of Black women of sex work, just because of the deviancy that they described onto this group of Black women, and not because of any behaviors or work that they were engaging in. So after like a final instance in which police officers, were targeting a Black gathering in the street, both police officers and Black folks were killed. But in a response to that, the white populace, including white police officers, rampaged throughout the town, killing and attacking and sexually assaulting and raping people who lived in Memphis. Most notably, Frances Thompson, who was a young Black trans woman living in Memphis at the time. She was newly freed and had suffered multiple acts of sexual assault at the hands of white police officers. And it was after this event, or this massacre, she went to be one of the first trans people to testify in front of Congress ever, but specifically about her experiences with police violence, with sexual violence, all of these sorts of, interwoven forms of gendered violence and she was kind of the pioneer for a lot of like the anti-violence work that we know of now, the police violence work that we know of now. And it's really important to hold that lens and that narrative, because I'm sure if I'd posed the same question, the chat would have just been as silent. Like, who knows of Frances Thompson? Just a few months later, you can move to the next slide. In the land known as New Orleans, but preferably referred to as Bulbancha, because Bulbancha is still a place. There was, similar tensions. This was very specifically the massacre in New Orleans, or Bulbancha, was in response to a Black labor struggle. So there were Black laborers who were getting together to try and form a convention around which to organize around their material needs. It's like these are Black laborers right after the Civil War. This was a moment where, again, they were trying to figure out like, how can we get free for real? Because reading the Emancipation Proclamation to us 2 years late did not get us free. Similar response from white police officers, and they massacred like dozens, if not hundreds, of Black residents in Bulbancha. And it is these riots or massacres that, if you can go to the next slide, that served as the inspiration for the passage of the 13th Amendment. And the 14th, 15th Amendment came soon after, throughout the Reconstruction era. But the 13th Amendment was specifically inspired by the riots and the massacres that were happening right after they said slavery was abolished in 1865. So in 1865, Amendment 13 went on books that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, will essentially place somebody behind bars as punishment. So we saw that they wanted to, again, try to abolish slavery and limit its scope in name, but in reality, they just reinscribed it again. So you can move towards the next slide. We see slave catchers to cops and plantations to prisons. In the late 1860s, and for much more time after that, we see the spread of the convict leasing system, where businesses, private owners were able to hire Black folks who are being increasingly targeted under Black codes, who can hire Black folks behind bars or otherwise in shackles to build their railroads, to chop down their trees, to mine for coal, so on and so forth. Here's a picture from 1868, it's the Georgia, Florida, Alabama Railroad. I picked this picture because I'm from Georgia, not originally, but that Georgia's home. So in 1868, to build this railroad line, they leased out 100 incarcerated Black folks for $2,500 a year. The Black codes essentially provided fodder for the machine in former Confederate states. And basically, Black folks were able to be legally disenfranchised under the convict leasing system, under Black codes and Jim Crow up until the 1930s, and we saw that continue to spiral out. So we can move forward into more contemporary examples. You can hit it again. So it's important to talk about another Black trans pioneer and the sacrifice that Black trans folks have had to make in the movement. You might not know enough about Lucy Hicks Anderson. She's best known for her time alive in 1920 to 1945. Again, when all of these when we see prison slavery being further entrenched in our society, when we see police violence taking on a specifically anti-trans, anti-queer, anti-gender, non-conforming lens, Lucy Hicks Anderson was our pioneer for marriage equality. She was charged for not just perjury, but also for fraud for her marriage to a man. Because, you know, trans women are not seen by the state as real women. So she was criminalized for embodying gender in non-normative ways, and was seen as a liar. That's the perjury part. She was seen as a liar for having married a man, because at that time, and you know, in still many ways now, marriage is seen as an institution that should be enjoyed between one man and one woman. So she lied for that, but then was also seen as a fraud because she was collecting GI benefits from her husband, who was a veteran. And of course, she served that time in a men's prison. Her gender and the way she embodied it was not going to be fully seen or respected. But I'm sure many people would not know her name or recognize her story. You know, we recently celebrated the 5-year anniversary of the passage of marriage equality in the United States. But like, what does it mean for people to be able to marry freely if like some people had to like be brutalized and incarcerated in order for that to happen, if people are still being brutalized and incarcerated while others can enjoy like these liberties of marriage equality. And also, marriage equality isn't something that can even be enjoyed by all in the United States. For example, disabled folks don't have access to marriage equality. They can't get married without completely losing all of the like paltry rights that they get from our government. And we also know that many Black folks, Black, queer, and trans folks are disabled at the same time. So it's important to, again, hold the most marginalized as we talk about police violence, as we talk about struggles for equality, quote unquote. And I think that kind of transitions nicely into my next point, which is on the next slide. So I know y'all know we got lots of queers on this. I know we got lots of queers on this call, lots of trans folks on the call. So y'all know about Stonewall Rebellion. But do a little thing in the chat, make a thumbs up, whatever, if you've heard of the Compton Cafeteria Riot. Okay, some activity, word. All right. So, okay, dope. Oh my goodness, I'm like actually looking at the names. Hey, there's some dope people here. So, the Compton Cafeteria riots happened 3 years prior to the Stonewall Rebellion that is often cited in Pride Month and, you know, very rarely outside of that. But the Compton Cafeteria riots happened 3 years prior to Stonewall Rebellion in 1966. 100 years to the day with all the different riots and stuff. So the Compton Cafeteria riot is basically like, it's very similar to what had happened at the Stonewall Rebellion. You know, this was a space. The Compton Cafeteria was a space where especially like poor Black, queer, and trans people, sex workers, immigrants and refugees would like come, hang out, and the business owners did not like this dangerous underclass, scaring away the good clientele. So they had a working relationship with police officers who would regularly target and arrest folks who were in that space. So this riot in August of 1966, they called the police, and at that time they said, we've had enough, we're not going to take it anymore. And they had an uprising that, you know, in a lot of ways was like the pre-spark to the spark that we know of as the Stonewall Rebellion, you know, where we hear these larger names of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and Storme DeLarverie, and Miss Major, of course. But yeah, like there's been a long thread of police violence having a specifically anti-trans and anti-queer lens. There's always been this this connection of business owners utilizing police to protect their wealth. Police officers, like that's what they're here to do. They protect the white and wealthy. That's who they protect and serve, and they punish and enslave the rest of us. Also, I realized my math was just like while I'm talking, because, you know, I just be talking for real. So I do want to correct something I said earlier. The 13th to 15th Amendments were definitely passed in response to the tensions that happened after the Civil War ended in 1865. But the 14th and 15th Amendments were more specifically passed in response to those riots because they actually came after. Chronology and time, you know, I'm always kind of like doing this. So yeah, let's move on. So the prison industrial complex, I'd like to, you know, read a quote from Angela Davis, who has been a forerunner in work around prison abolition and is also just like the embodiment of revolutionary praxis. So when talking about the social problems of poverty, like poor health, things like that, she's saying these social problems are often veiled by being conveniently grouped together under the category of crime and by the automatic attribution of criminal behavior to people of color. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when the human beings contending with them are relegated to cages. Prisons thus perform a feat of magic, but prisons do not disappear problems, they disappear human beings. And the practice of disappearing vast numbers of people from poor, immigrant, and racially marginalized communities has literally become big business. So I know we're talking about the origins of police, but policing and prisons, they are inextricable from one another, because the police target the populations that are then used to fill jail and prison cells. And it's from there that we get a lot of the work and materials and goods that people belonging to quote unquote free society get to enjoy on their own time. So after the 60s, of course, the law enforcement spread exponentially. The war on drugs during the 70s and 80s was another period of time in which crime and criminal was redefined and reinscribed, which was backed by policy and law changes like mandatory minimums, 3 strikes policies, stop and frisk searches. So police were given another carte blanche just on top of the fucking stack they already had. Sorry, I'm trying to be less of a swear bear. So on top of the stack they already had to target poor Black people, and police became more militarized during this period as well. And prisons became more sophisticated. To bring in another lens of like queerness and transness, there was a rash of passing of hate crime laws in the 1990s. After we, lost millions of people globally, but here in the United States, hundreds of thousands of people to the HIV/AIDS crisis and criminalization in that way. The larger LGBTQ movement responded by, really pushing for hate crime legislation in the 90s, which is just another way of like building out the prison industrial complex and criminalizing more people, because when laws are created to criminalize behaviors, there are always going to be people in communities who are targeted most under that. So yeah, as police ramped up their targeting of communities, the people they target have to go somewhere. So more prisons and jails were constructed and existing ones expanded. As we saw, like the 13th Amendment gave it to us in 1865. Slavery was then it's now being established more and more commonly as punishment for being criminal, for being seen as criminal. So we can move on to the next slide and sort of talk about how this specifically targets queer and trans folks and the intersections of that. This is an infographic pull from the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, where they're analyzing how the criminalization of poorness and poverty, as well as the criminalization of trans people, intersects, because trans people are often working class and poor, intersects to produce and reproduce violence and harassment, either before getting targeted by police, while getting targeted by police, or once they've made it behind bars. There's heightened sensitivity of trans folks, especially trans women of color, especially Black trans women under the prison industrial complex. So to move on to the next slide. So these are 2 individuals who are very blatantly and like directly killed by policing and prisons. Layleen Polanco is an Afro-Latinx trans woman who last year died behind bars while at Rikers Island, which is a notoriously violent men's jail. She died behind bars while being held on $500, while being held on a $500 bond. So she died in an environment that's not affirming of anyone's identity, because jails and prisons are violent inherently. But it was a men's prison, so she was incredibly vulnerable as a trans woman, especially as a Black trans woman. But she was also held behind bars specifically because she was poor, couldn't afford bond, couldn't afford a cash bail. And that's why, a lot of organizations like the Columbus Freedom Fund right now here in Columbus, but across our country, are doing work to bail people out of jail, because things like this happen. Black trans women are dying behind bars and then getting laughed at while dying. That's something that recently came out, that she was being mocked in her dying moments. And so this is just one iteration of many that shows the inherent violence of prisons and how they can't provide rehabilitation. They're not life-giving structures. And then of course, we see Tony McDade, who I want to raise up his name. He's a Black man, but a Black trans man who died in the middle of all these uprisings that we're living through currently around police violence that took the life of a Black cis man. And Tony McDade's name was not one that I heard like echoing throughout the streets when I was attending protests around the time of his death. So again, like Black trans folks are facing like incredible amounts of violence and in very pointed and cruel ways by the police and prison state that we live under. And we see that, with these specific examples, but also more generally. And you can move on to the next slide. So, do a little thingy. If you've heard of the term misogynoir or trans-misogynoir. Okay. Dope. So if you are a Black person who just said something in the chat, would you mind typing out a definition in the chat? Just want to see from my folks how you would define misogynoir. Okay, got misogyny, but specific to Black women. Term for societal prejudice against people who are both Black and women. Intersection of anti-Blackness and misogyny. Yep. Thank you for everybody who sent the definitions in the chat. I appreciate it. Feel free to keep going if you want to add something extra, So yes, misogynoir is the term misogyny, and noir meaning Black in French. And that was coined by Moya Bailey, who is a queer Black linguist. And yes, it's meant specifically to capture the simultaneous racial and gender oppressions that Black women face. Though that term might be newer, Black women have long been studying and theorizing and talking about the specific intersecting oppressions that they've faced. Like that the matrix of oppression, we have the term intersectionality, but also going back to Ain't I a Woman? Like that speech by Sojourner Truth, like it's kind of been something that's been looked at by Black women for a long time. So trans-misogynoir is just another, intersection talking about the specific oppressions that Black trans women face. And Milan Nicole Sherry coined the hashtag Black Trans Lives Matter. She's a Black trans woman, so she coined that hashtag, created that hashtag to talk specifically about the experiences that Black trans women and Black trans people. Other ways that trans-misogynoir manifests within the police state is kind of like with stop and frisk, and how Black men and brown men can be subject to being assumed criminal in that way and being searched. Black trans women often have to contend with this dynamic of walking while trans. So they're often detained or arrested for looking out of place or abnormal, also often assumed to be engaging in sex work. Again, for this additional ascription of deviancy. Which, is kind of like a double-edged sword, because Black trans women also often have to engage in survival economies like sex work in order to survive under a capitalistic economy that isn't looking out for their lives in the first place. the passage of FOSTA and SESTA, which are the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act and the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, were bills passed within the past 5 years as a way to curb sex trafficking, but really as a way to attack sex workers and reduce their freedoms, and it's put sex workers, especially those who are already vulnerable, in a more vulnerable position. Thinking about how this has limited people's ability to safely talk about sex work online, advertise sex work online, which has now pushed sex workers into maybe relying on street-based sex work. This is even more of a concern in an era of pandemic where people should not, and like if like they're trying to look out for their health, like should not be outside, but like also people who are working class don't have the luxury of getting to negotiate that, you know? And when we talk about essential workers, like, are we thinking about sex workers? Are we thinking about people who have to rely on like selling drugs to like make their ends meet? Like, we have to think about like when we're thinking about like work and whose work is essential, that also requires thinking about like people whose work is invisibilized, like domestic workers, people who are like even cashiers and like those who are working in groceries, like they are invisibilized in a lot of ways in these conversations. So yeah, got off on a little work tangent. So moving on to the next slide. So we talked about people who are more directly affected by prisons and police, but it's also important to frame interpersonal violence against Black trans people as within the conversation of like policing and white supremacy, because any act of violence against a Black life, it serves the interests of white supremacy, which supports and is supported by policing. So Ayanna Dior was a Black trans woman who was attacked brutally by a mob of both Black cis men and Black cis women in Minnesota the same week as George Floyd protests started to erupt for real in Minnesota. So that, for me, hearing her story also reminded me of Malaysia Booker's story, who was a Black trans woman murdered last year in Dallas, I believe, weeks after she had been similarly attacked by a mob of people who were in her community, Black folks, Black cis folks. And I kind of wanted to bring these two into the fore, and Malaysia especially, because like we're literally being hunted. Like Malaysia was hunted and pursued after having already been attacked, and then her life was taken from her. And there's something especially going on in Dallas, because within the past few weeks, we've lost lots of Black trans women in Dallas, especially. So when we're calling for like Black Lives Matter in these moments where, again, we have like more conversation around abolition and fighting against police violence, we have to think of police violence as something that has been, like the 1819 law in South Carolina has been inscribed into like general populace. Has been inscribed especially into general white populace for the way that they treat and see Black people. But policing is something that has also made its way into the heads of cisgender folks who are part of the owning class, folks who, you know, have power to flex over others and choose to do so. Policing is not just the structure, it's the way in which we behave towards and treat each other. So we can move on. So the prison industrial complex, I don't think I didn't define it. So I'll do that. So the prison industrial complex is, it is a overlapping network of government interests, industries that are supported by and that proliferate or spread surveillance, imprisonment, and policing. And we see how the prison industrial complex, like part of the complex is our education system. And I don't want to go into too much detail. I'd like to eventually like move on to like more of the abolition part of this. But you know, we've seen like across our country, like there are more cops than there are counselors in many of our children's schools. The local group CPD out of CCS, or Columbus Police Department out of Columbus City Schools, has been doing some work around pressuring their administration as well as local police to remove police officers from their school, and they just had a win where the contract was not renewed. And so there's still more to be done around making sure that this win is permanent and that our kids can enjoy a learning environment that is not just police free, but you know, once we defund the police, we can use some of that money to reinvest in our children's schools so they have like smaller class sizes, air conditioning if we're dreaming really big, you know. We can move to the next slide. So you can't spell police without ICE. Law enforcement and immigration enforcement have grown hand in hand. We're thinking about monitoring and controlling certain populations. That has been true of monitoring the movement and access of immigrants and refugees. ICE regularly collaborates with police departments all over the country in order to more efficiently target, detain, and eventually deport undocumented folks. And you know, though there's lack of official research about Black LGBTQ migrants, refugees, specifically, we can just draw conclusions based off of all these intersecting oppressions that they have the most to lose in an incredibly capitalistic, xenophobic, white supremacist society. You can move on. So this slide is a little bit old. That's why I was looking a little like, what is that? But so just to talk specifically about like violence of policing in Ohio, Columbus police have already been investigated by the Department of Justice for excessive force against Black folks here. Under Ron O'Brien, who is the Franklin County prosecutor, under his 20-year reign as prosecutor, he has allowed police abuse to continue by refusing to mete out any accountability to killer cops. And, you know, I think part of my journey as an abolitionist is not necessarily focusing on charging killer cops, because I don't see policing or prisons as a solution to policing or prisons. But should Ron O'Brien like be fired or like step down? Absolutely. I don't want another prosecutor though. So what I can say is that as an abolitionist, I am looking for accountability from our elected officials, which would look like firing killer cops and removing them from the force and ensuring that they cannot, patrol our streets for another day. And, the Black Pride 4 is also an example specifically of police violence against Black, queer, and trans people. And I also know from like my own experiences with like organizing to support the Black Pride 4, also the real struggles that came with like trying to have their stories like properly heard and respected, because of the very real like homophobia and transphobia, in addition to anti-Blackness that exists in the Columbus organizing community. So we can move on. So now it's hopefully clear from like the first part of this presentation that police only exist to terrorize our communities. Like I said before, they do not protect and serve, they punish and enslave, or more accurately, they only protect and serve the white and wealthy. So we can move on. With that in mind, how do we get free? You can do the animation. Yeah, so we get free by building an abolitionist trans and queer movement with everything we've got. Let's abolish the fucking police. That first part up top is part of this incredible anthology called Captive Genders, which is about queer and trans embodiment in the prison state or under the prison industrial complex. I'm not remembering the exact subtitle, but Captive Genders is the name of the work, and I highly recommend it. So yeah, that is how we do the thing. Policing has rapidly mutated so that it's infected so many facets of our everyday lives. We, especially Black, queer, and trans people, cannot be free living under a police state. And when people suggest reforming the police, I cannot help but think that there's no reforming or rehabilitating its history that is embedded in literal like slave catching, that is embedded in squashing labor movement, that is embedded in protecting wealth over people. And it's still, the police state still has an expansive body count today. Yes, it is being recorded, Claudia. I just noticed the question, and I will be done by 1:30. let's hope. So we can move on. So what does abolition mean? Critical resistance says that it's a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. So like I said before, abolition in 1865 was a negative process. It only took away abolition in name while secretly reinscribing it, sometimes not even super secretly. It's just right there in the 13th Amendment. What we want and what we're advocating for, what we have been advocating for, is positive abolition, where it's not just a destruction of the old world, but also a creation of the new. Angela Davis, who co-founded Critical Resistance, who also wrote the book Abolition Democracy, talks about abolition as a positive process, where we have to get really creative about thinking about the alternatives and new institutions that we want to build in the void of the police state. And like I said, abolition is also not just about the structures. It's not just about, deconstructing the cops that we have in our head, the anti-Blackness that we have in our head, but also what are we going to do to replace it? How are we going to think about or rethink the ways in which we relate to each other? How are we going to rewire our minds to like conceive of gender in new ways, to conceive of harm and responding to it in new ways? Like abolition is going to be like a process that happens both like internally and individually, but as well as collectively. So what would it look like to live in a society free of this harm? Like as I asked at the end of that slide, we can move on. I'm not gonna ask you to play this video, but if you want to check later, Mary Hooks, who is a co-director of Southerners on New Ground, has a video that she did of talking specifically about how the prison industrial complex touches queer and trans communities. And then just to move on again, so why abolition and not reform? Again, I feel like my ancestors, I'll get to that later, but yeah, I feel like my ancestors weren't like hoping for reform slavery. They weren't hoping for like Black slave catchers. They were wanting total and complete freedom. Reforming the police and prisons won't reduce the harm that they inflict on our communities. Like I saw somebody say the other day, like we should not be adding bricks to the building. Reform buys us time to be less uncomfortable, but it doesn't ultimately lead to liberation. We deserve better. Slavery is still currently existing because we've seen how it just like changed from slavery in name to Jim Crow and voter suppression laws during Jim Crow era, convict leasing, like all of these different things. There's no reforming a system where its original intent was to harm, cage, and kill Black people. So if you move to the next slide, you can see some examples of reformist platforms. Like in the top left, we have 8 Can't Wait, which is I think created in part by D. Ray McKesson, who is like known for being a grifter. So, don't support 8 Can't Wait. We have on the right Campaign Zero, another reformist platform, and then more locally, Heal Columbus, another reformist platform. And they kind of all borrow some like common things like community oversight board, or giving cops more cameras, or maybe adding more Black cops, brown cops, what have you, cops with purple skin and white polka dots, like white supremacists like to say, to the force. So these tactics don't work to reduce the scope of policing, because community oversight boards are just reactive. They don't change, they don't stop police violence from happening, and they're also very, very constricted by the whims of the police union, who really pulls the strings of the police department. Adding body cam footage, we've how often have we seen Black folks get killed in plain sight on camera? The officer who killed George Floyd was doing so on camera. There were officers standing around him with cameras on their bodies, presumably, and those 8 minutes went by and we still had another Black person dead at the hands of the police state. Adding cops of color to the force, again, doesn't fix anything, because that was a cop of color. Philando Castile was murdered by a cop of color. A pig is a pig is a pig. So we can move on. Oh, also, Mayor Ginther said that Columbus is already doing 4 out of the 8 Can't Wait. So that really goes to show you that these reformist platforms are not enough to get us free. Another video you can check out on your own time is How Do We Prepare for Abolition by Kamal Walton. And I think that'll prepare you to think about the own possibilities you can take up here. You can move on. So like I said, my ancestors had bigger dreams than reformed slavery and Black slave catchers. We can and we deserve to dream bigger than these jackbooted forces patrolling our neighborhoods and taking away our opportunities to live life. If you move on, you'll see the 8 to Abolition, which is the much better response to the 8 Can't Wait, since that started making its rounds. So definitely follow and support 8 to Abolition. The Black Abolitionist Collective of Ohio, it's a new group that started up here in Columbus. They're in support of this platform. BQIC, we have our own abolitionist platform, but we are also in support of the 8 to Abolition, not the 8 Can't Wait. And if you move on, you'll see 2 charts on the next 2 slides from critical resistance. It's called Reformist Reforms versus Abolitionist Steps in Policing. And it outlines here on this red slide, so red meaning no, stop, different forms of things that don't actually work to free people or get people or keep people safe. So body cameras, community policing, more training, that's what is that? That's a waste of time. So yeah, so it's kind of outlining why these things don't work as well, besides, just me saying it's a waste of time. But then they also outline on the next slide, abolitionist steps in policing. So showing you the steps that you can take to actually reducing the power of policing in your communities, which would look like, organizing against the creation of new prisons and refusing to allow more police officers to be added to the force. Sorry, 1 second. Suspending the use of paid administrative leave for cops under investigation. Different things like that. Cops are getting overtime for responding to the protests locally as well as in other places. So what would it look like if they just didn't get money to brutalize us, and to brutalize us in off hours? On the next slide, you'll see BQIC's 12 to Abolish 12 that we worked on in collaboration with Mia Santiago from the Columbus Freedom Coalition, another local abolitionist org we encourage you to support if you haven't been already. And so we are, currently building a campaign, a platform on these 12 to abolish 12, because each demand is kind of addressing a very big thing, and police state is like, we live under it. It's a systemic issue that is going to take a variety of approaches, a variety of tactics, but most importantly, a collective and intersectional effort to truly make sure that we, as Black folks, but especially more marginalized Black folks, can get free. I know one question that people have, next slide, in conversations around abolition is, what do we do with the murderers and rapists? And my initial response to that is, well, currently a lot of the murderers and the rapists are working on police forces. They're working in prisons and jails and detention centers. They're working as cops in our children's schools. Cops, they are the predominant killer. In a lot of ways, they are the ones who, when we think about gun violence, like the police officers committing most acts of gun violence, sexual violence is the second most used form of violence that they enact on people in their charge, second only to physical and lethal violence. So the murderers and rapists that we really have to contend with, quite honestly, are police officers. My friend made the joke the other day, like, the call is coming from inside the house. So that's like one thing, like, I think like the main way that we can advocate against like sexual assault and physical violence against people is also, it's through police and prison abolition. But, I think it's also important to recognize that people who are most often criminalized for sexual violence, for example, are those who survived it. So prison and police abolition also helps like survivors like heal and get their own like form of rehabilitation that they need, because people like Marissa Alexander or Crystal Kaiser cannot heal in environments that are inherently traumatic. And I think like also in, to be like just more practical and thinking about like just like murderers, people who do harm in our own communities, is thinking about how can we provide and respond to harm in like more community-based ways. Do we know who our neighbors are? Do we know who we feel safe around? Do those people know what our triggers are, how to respond to them? So in thinking about like what do we do with the murders or rapists, sure, we'll need like a specified group of like healers or mental health experts to work with these people to uncover why they like want to work with these like forms of harm. But to center survivors and to center the most oppressed is again going to go back to the point of prison abolition and police abolition. Next slide, you see some tactics to dismantle the police state. So defunding police departments, like, we're hearing those calls here in Columbus, working to disarm and demilitarize the police. We saw them using tear gas against people, which has like had lots of reproductive harm on folks, in addition to having taken somebody's life. Decriminalization of almost every crime, because almost every crime that we have is just a representation of either people needing to like do things to survive or people having been criminalized because of their identities. And next slide. Oh my God, I'm so thirsty and we are here. So yeah, so one thing it's really important to note is that this quote from Captive Genders, that is my favorite. So abolition is not some distant future, but something we create in every moment when we say no to the traps of empire and yes to the nourishing possibilities dreamed of and practiced by our ancestors and friends. Black people, our ancestors used to read skies to find freedom. We used to follow drums and sing their way across rivers to find freedom. So we deserve to dream bigger, and we deserve to push for abolition and like push for the end of anti-Blackness as we know it. We can start believing, we should start believing that another world is possible. And we do have the power to collectively dismantle the systems that are killing us. And that'll require organization that will require education. So if you move forward, be quick. We have like things coming up. We're going to be power mapping some of our demands. You can move forward to the next slide, and we can come back to questions at the end. So we'll be power mapping our demands. We encourage Black LGBTQ+ folks to join BQIC if you're interested in actually organizing and learning more. We also have some events coming up where you can hear, so book club is about like Black liberation. We're going to be reading Beyond Survival, which is strategies and stories from the transformative justice movement, because again, we don't want to just tear down police, but we also want to be more prepared as Black, queer, and trans people to respond to harm in our communities, as well as maintaining the spaces that we have to share our stories with the open mic, and then our member meeting and canvassing. So yeah, I just encourage people to stay up on BQIC and what we got going on. Move to the next slide, please. We're currently raising money for office space so that we can safely organize towards our needs. If there's all of our information, follow us, so on and so forth. And then to end, you can go to the next slide. Again, my personal Venmo is at fuck all cops. Thanks in all quotations, and I mean it with my chest. From non-Black people, for my work without material support, it's just hollow lip service. I don't care about your thanks if it doesn't mean that I can continue doing my work. So, and it doesn't mean like me and my people can continue living to see another day. So the best way non-Black people can thank me is either by, seriously engaging in the struggle against anti-Blackness, which like, I'll hold my breath, or, by at least sending money to the people who have the lived experiences to organize towards our own liberation. That's what I got. I talked for an hour and a half straight, and there is about 4 minutes left in this for people to, say what they need,
yes.
share in the chat.
I am going to stop the recording so that people can ask information freely.